So this week we'll be looking at a new type of populist party, the type that don't fit well into the types that we've looked at earlier. I guess that's unsurprising because if they did fit in, they would have been included then. But we'll develop an awareness of Valence populist parties as an additional category to the left and right wing populism that we've seen in Europe. We'll compare three cases which will help us understand the emergence, the ideology, the style of populism and party structure of some of these parties, and appreciate the tricky definition or classificational issues surrounding Valence populist parties. So it's important not to think of these as a residual category, right? What's left over once you've classified all the other parties, but actually at least I think we can put forward the claim that these are a special type of populist parties that are rarer than the type that we've looked at previously, but still make sense as a grouping. And the ones that we'll look at are the Five Star Movement, which was initially led by Beppe Grillo. At the moment the Five Star Movement is the largest party in Italy. ANO, which is led by Andreas Babis, who is currently the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. And then we also have the snappily titled Ordinary People and Independent Personalities in Slovakia, which is essentially they all claim to really not be parties, but is a platform to allow independent candidates to stand in Slovakia. So before we look at Valence populist parties specifically, we can look at just broadly other populist parties in Europe. Now we can see from the graph here, these are basically all the parties that aren't classed as part of the big party families. So, populist radical left, populist radical right, conservative, liberal, Christian Democrat or whatever. I've ignored all them. I've only included the agrarian or centre parties, the regionalist parties, because we know regionalism is a thin-centred ideology as well, or the ones that haven't been classified into no family. And then those parties that have a populism score of over 5. So we can see there are some parties that are populist that aren't captured by left and right, and that are perhaps atypical of other party families. And I've listed them in the table with the vote share. Now, this isn't, these parties haven't been selected based on any kind of ideological criteria or issue criteria beyond their level of populism, right? This is just to kind of show some of those parties. Now, as we'll see in the next slide, what Valence populism allows us to do is to develop an analytical framework for classifying what types of parties we should be looking at as a third type. So the ones here that you see on this slide would be a residual category, right? If we created a party a party type based on these cases, that would be residual. There'd be nothing that we're basing that on that kind of underpins them beyond being rated over 5 on the populism scale by Popper. So Valence populists, we've also split in the past left and right wing populism. We've also looked at inclusionary and exclusionary populism, and although it's not the case that left wing and inclusive populism and right wing and exclusive populism are necessarily synonymous, it is more common to find left wing populists that are inclusionary and right wing populists that are exclusionary than vice versa. Zulianello argues, however, that not all parties which claim to be populist or which are populist can be easily located on the left-right spectrum. It is these cases that we'll be examining in this lecture. The article linked there provides a number of cases of populist Valence parties which we will be exploring. Happily, there's a handy data set called Populist Parties in European Parliament Elections, compiled by Garner and Zulianello, which highlights which parties they consider to be examples of Valence populists, and I've mapped them out on the diagram. Now, you can see there are some differences there compared to the previous slide. So, do you know what? Right, okay, we won't go into that too much because you can see them quite clearly, but what is important to note is that it's not just the ones that are based on no family or agrarian or centre parties that are classified as Valence. We have examples of parties that Popper classifies as conservative. In ZZ, so the Croatian Human Shield Party, we have a party that is classified as radical right, but is the radical right outlier in the sense that Popper classifies it as on the left. And then we have the LCP, the M5, Five Star Movement, and ANO, which aren't assigned a family by Popper. So there's not many parties here, out of the whole constellation of parties, that are classed as a populist Valence party. But there's still a good handful there. And it shows that they come from a mix of different party families. What is interesting is the GERB, a Bulgarian party, does not seem to be very populist. I don't know why they have classified this party as populist, and why they disagree with Popper, but that's not to say that it's wrong. So I think Wikipedia, that bastion of knowledge, counts the GERB as populist, but Popper doesn't. And I mean, it's completely normal for academics to disagree as well. So it's just something to bear in mind. Anyway, we have this data set, and we'll be looking at 3 of these parties. Like I said, the Five Star Movement in Italy, ANO in the Czech Republic, and the Ordinary People and Independent Personalities in Slovakia, which is in government at the moment. So what is Valence populism? For Zulinello, whereas traditional left and right-wing populists have positional characteristics, i.e. characteristics coming from being on the left or the right, which shape how they compete electorally, Valence populist parties compete exclusively by focusing on non-positional issues, such as fighting corruption, increased transparency, democratic reform, moral integrity, whilst emphasising anti-establishment motives. Now, not competing from a left or right position is not the same as being a centrist party, because centrism reflects an ideological position, the centre, right, which influences how you compete electorally. Whereas Zulinello notes the distinctive feature of Valence politics and Valence populism is precisely the emphasis on non-positional issues, such as competence, such as performance, such as corruption. Now, this doesn't mean that Valence populists don't occupy or adopt specific positions, for example on welfare reform, but the way in which they get to the policies they advocate is not through positional ideology. So, on the left, it's not because of equality, or on the right because of efficiency, but rather welfare reform will be a consequence of their policy stance being informed by conceptions of populism. So it could be that the corrupt elite have kept the population poor, and welfare reform is one way to address that. Now, what makes these actors interesting and worth studying is, as Zulinello argues, the unadulterated conception of populism, and with other ideological elements playing a marginal or a secondary role, is flexible, it's free-floating, it's often inconsistent. And so, whereas we tend to think of populism as a thin-centred ideology that attached to a host ideology, for these Valence populist parties, there isn't actually anything often that this thin-centred ideology is attaching to. They subscribe to a much purer version of populism, so they are neither left or right wing, neither exclusionary or exclusionary. And clearly, this is an approach rooted in Mudd's ideational approach to understanding populism. And so, to that end, if we think the Valence populists aren't really aren't positional, then this left-right axis that I've used here is kind of the wrong way of going about it. And so we expect to see spread, which is what we've got on the left-right axis. And often parties like ANO, like Five Star Movement, will come out at the centre or around the centre, because on average they end up with a kind of syncretic politics where you end up like the average of all their policy positions will be in the centre, if you're taking a mix of right-wing policies and left-wing policies, right? So the Five Star Movement was founded on the 4th of October 2009 by Beppe Grillo, a comedian and blogger. As Wikipedia states, the Five Star Movement is variously considered populist, anti-establishment, environmentalist, anti-immigration, anti-globalist and Eurosceptic. The party has also been described as new right and right-wing due to its anti-immigration stance, despite its promotion of policies usually advocated by the Italian left-wing, such as citizens' income and green-inspired environmental politics. So instantly, from this you can see why these Valence populist parties are so hard to classify, or could be hard to classify, because they borrow eclectically from both left and right. After the 2018 general election, the Five Star Movement became the largest party and formed a government with the populist radical right party, the League. This was billed as Europe's first populist government. Both parties were Eurosceptic, but dropped any ambition to exit the euro. The movement had called for a referendum on the issue in 2014. Instead, their programme involved major welfare reform to reduce poverty and also reduce the tax burden, both of which would put this country on a collision course with the EU due to Italy's large public debt levels. And they also focused on reducing immigration, increasing deportations, and trying to get the EU to strike a friendlier tone with Russia. So turning to ideology, as to be expected with Valence populist parties, Evaldi et al. Find that the Five Star Movement may exemplify a case of post-ideological populist idiosyncrasy with no clear ideological attachment. The Five Star Movement is a synthetic reference point, and it's noteworthy in their analysis since it draws an incoherent and ambiguous way from a variety of non-populist ideologies. In an analysis of the movement's populism, Mosca and Tronconi label the movement's populism eclectic and note how they combine left-wing economics, a universal basic income, strong state intervention in the economy, anti-austerity rhetoric, alongside anti-tax discourse. And interestingly, the Five Star Movement's voters, however, are pretty close to the Italian average when it comes to the economics. So it's not as if the Five Star Movement is necessarily emulating its voters. But on the issue of immigration, the party blur left and right positions as well. They mix international humanitarianism with national securitization and the desire to reduce immigration into the country. To that end, Font et al. Find that while Syriza and Podemos can be found on the inclusive side of the exclusive-inclusive cleavage, the movement falls between the exclusionary and inclusionary pole, right? Because whilst the discourse used by party elite isn't exclusive, it isn't inclusive either. So as Font et al. Note, the New Year speeches and the electoral manifestos demonstrate very limited signs of inclusion towards categories which go beyond nationals and Italians. Although the speeches put an emphasis on direct democracy and expansionary forms of welfare, these elements are strongly associated with the people who share their language, Italian, and who therefore are seen as citizens. No direct mention is made of immigrants or marginalised people in inclusionary terms. As Mosca and Tronconi note, from the perspective of the voters, views again are similar to those of the average Italian and located on a medium position between the Democratic Party on one side and Forza Italia and the Lega Nord on the other. So when it comes to party ideology and their voter base, Five Star Movement voters are more extreme in their anti-party positions, whilst they're located between the mainstream Italian parties on the centre-left and the centre-right on substantive policy issues. So they're centrist kind of almost economically or on the positional issues, but when it comes to the populist anti-party discourse, Five Star Movement voters are much more extreme. To that end, the eclectic nature of the Five Star Movement's populism seems to be able to attract voters with more moderate views. Now, when it comes to analysing the party's populist discourse, Evaldi et al. Argue that people are articulated as the common citizen or as Italians, whilst elites with being bureaucrats. Now, this populism doesn't take on the nativism or ethnic dimension of the populist radical right, or necessarily the overt left-wing financial tones of Syriza and Podemos's anti-Germany, anti-ECB rhetoric based from the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, but nor does it have a more open or encompassing version or inclusive notion of the people. For example, in terms of this or to say Five Star Movement is not part of left, part of what they class as the old politics includes trade unions, right? Which Podemos probably wouldn't, criticise, Syriza wouldn't criticise. Indeed, as Mosca and Tronconi note, anti-establishment views and a rejection of any kind of intermediation, i.e. any institution, organisation that comes between, say, the people and the exercise of power, any kind of intermediation, can be detected in the political discourse of the party, with different references to different spheres of social life. So in the political realm, it's parties. In the media realm, it's professional journalists. In the economic and financial realm, it's banks and it's unions, right? All of these organisations are seen as part of the old system, the old politics, and basically need to go. Now, the movement has become increasingly patriotic, right? Not nativist, but increasingly patriotic. which ties in with a soft Eurosceptic position. Now, this was typically vague. So before 2014, the EU didn't feature much in the Five Star Movement's platform, but the party became more Eurosceptic as a strategic move of an opposition protest party, which was trying to capitalise on growing dissatisfaction, distrust and frustration of the Italian electorate with Europe and the European Union, according to Franzosi. Now, harking back to its online roots, the Five Star Movement's ideas for ensuring the power of the people over the elite is via direct democracy within a Web 2.0 framework, as a way of bypassing traditional intermediate organisations, traditional political structures, which the movement claims does not listen to the people. And as such, many scholars, such as Bickerton and Anicetti, have argued that the Five Star Movement, like Podemos in Spain, are a new type of populist party, techno-populists, which combines a populist ideology with a distinctively technocratic conception of politics as problem-solving, allied to a form of technological utopianism, which assumes that the internet will offer a more effective way of mobilising collective intelligence compared to what can be achieved using traditional political parties. Basically, the web will allow people to come together without requiring other institutions in order to formulate policy that reflects the will of the people, right? So this ties into the concept of the will of the people being frustrated by intermediate institutions and the will of the people being the true, authentic guide to political behaviour, raw and unmediated. Okay, and it's further reason why Five Star Movement opposes the mediation of the old politics of parties, trade unions, NGOs, banks, whatever. Now, in terms of organisation, the movement is so critical of traditional political parties that it calls itself a social movement and a non-party. However, organisationally, the party is relatively small. The party does little in the way of mass mobilisation of supporters or voters, little in the way of conferences, and any meetups that are held of party members tend to be local or regional and outside the organisational scope of the party. Internally, the party is nominally democratic, right? And members decide on policies, on representatives, on coalition agreements via an online platform called Rousseau, kind of fittingly for a populist party, to use the name of the man who basically invented the concept of the general will, or at least made it popular, right? I don't want any philosophy students sending me angry letters. But despite this online platform that aims to decentralise decision-making and power, in reality, the leadership itself exerts a lot of power, and as Vittori notes, any conflict at the local level is still resolved ex imperio by the national leadership, as exemplified by the movement's withdrawal from local elections in several cities. Although the Five Star Movement project envisaged a leaderless movement centred on an empowered membership, this has very much not been borne out in practice. Now, students who took POLI223 might remember, well, they'd have many happy memories, but they might remember our discussions about business firm parties and other forms of party organisation. Well, in the case of Five Star Movement, a private company oversees crucial functions on behalf of the Five Star Movement, including candidate selection and management of the party's online decision-making platform. Now, this might lead us to assume that it reflects a business firm model based, for example, on Forza Italia, but unlike the business firm model, members do have an important role to play in setting policy and candidates, whilst members are marginalised in business firm organisations. Right, Forza Italia would never dream of giving its voters, its party members, a say over policy. And within the Five Star Movement, at least formally, members retain the last word on any decisions made by the leadership, and in some internal consultations they have reversed the leadership sponsored proposals. So although I kind of made a point before about the leadership having a lot of power, there are areas where the members can also exert influence. Vittori notes how Five Star might also be labelled a franchise party, where the party as a whole is recognisable by its common brand. It has a central organisation which determines the product line, i.e. policies, and sets standards for its production and labelling, perhaps in leaflet or campaign style, designs marketing and advertising strategy, and provides management help and training for local outlets, i.e. regional or local branches of parties. But local parties in the Five Star Movement are not powerful enough to prevent the centre from taking control on certain policy issues or on whether to contest elections, things like that. So the concept of a franchise party doesn't quite fit either. Alternatively, the Five Star Movement can be conceptualised as a movement party, the core components of which are the lack of a pure party in central office, i.e. the lack of a kind of party headquarters, insistence on an assembly-based structure, and consequently on direct democracy and anti-party rhetoric. Now, although this model of a movement party comes close, according to Vittori anyway, in explaining the movement, the party does lack the external social movement which typically underpins movement parties. In fact, often the party sees external social movements as just part of the old politics, because they act as intermediate institutions between the people and power. So instead, Vittori defines the Five Star Movement as unique in the sense that it has plebiscitarian elements seen in the distribution of its organisational resources, its management of the online platform, its top-down leadership selection process, and the power acquired by the leadership through recent statute reforms. Thus, the Five Star Movement can be defined as a plebiscitarian movement party, i.e. a political party with a weak intermediate structure and porous membership, coupled with a resourceful leadership which controls the main aspects of party organisation, i.e. the party centre has power over the organisation and structure and dominates resources within the party, but there are very few intermediate structures between the centre and the members themselves, right? Emphasised by the Rousseau system. Now, you might want to think in your discussions about whether this kind of Rousseauian software would be a good idea for political parties in the UK and why they might or might not want to use them. So the second party that we look at is ANO, or Anno 2011, Action of Dissatisfied Citizens. So really, when we talk about populist parties in the Czech Republic, we should start with Public Affairs, right, which was the first electorally successful populist party, or exclusively populist party in the history of the Czech Republic. However, that party has not been able to sustain its success, and it's been crowded out by ANO, and they are, a much more influential force today. So we'll focus on ANO instead, although there is a reading on the reading list that covers Public Affairs. So the emergence of ANO, right? ANO 2011 is a populist party founded by Andrej Babiš, the second richest person in the Czech Republic. His party has 78 out of 200 seats in the lower house, and he is prime minister. Babiš began talking about corruption in the Czech Republic and formed the association, so the Action of Dissatisfied Citizens, ANO, and ANO means yes in Czech. In 2011. It became an official party in 2012 and entered government as a junior coalition partner in 2014. Now, like the Five Star Movement, ANO identifies itself as a political movement rather than the party, and despite some people labelling Babiš the Czech Donald Trump, the party rejects classic left-right labels, although Babiš did go on record once saying ANO 2011 is a right-wing party with social empathy. So perhaps maybe Christian democratic in that respect. But most people, and including Popper, place it as outside established political party families. So Popper put them down as a party that is not part of any family. It's important to note that ANO uses an anti-corruption rhetoric, but it also aims to tackle things like unemployment and poor transport infrastructure. Or at least it had a Eurosceptic position before 2017, but this has been dampened down massively after the election. So for Stanley, Anno 2011 is a good example of centrist populism, which he argues became a much more prominent feature of Central and East European party systems in the second and third decade of transition from communism. After several elections, electorates in the region were increasingly disenchanted with established parties, which were perceived to have failed to deal with numerous deficiencies of post-communist governance, most noticeably corruption. Centrist populism was also a relatively cost-free way for parties to make an electoral impact, while attacking the elite from a distinct, thick ideological position. restricted the electoral potential of new parties, centrist populists could appeal to a range of voters purely on the basis of their dissatisfaction with the elite, rather than with reference to the specific nature of that dissatisfaction. And that's similar perhaps to some of the studies we looked at the week on left-wing populism, where we saw that populist parties like Podemos were able to attract voters who were not just left-wing, but who were also perhaps right-wing, but also had populist values, right? So by being a kind of what Stanley calls centrist populist party, or a Valence populist party, it allows to appeal to everybody across the left-right spectrum if they have some sort of kind of anti-elite sentiment or populist sentiment. And as is the case with ANO and also the Slovak case, populist parties were able to enter the political arena due to weakly consolidated party systems within Eastern and Central Europe in the post-communist era, but actually also applicable to Italy, which sees a lot of flexibility in its party system. Havlik also notes the electoral success of ANO, much like that of Public Affairs in 2010, can be best understood as a result of the deepened crisis of political trust in political parties and party democracy in general, and this was exacerbated by the economic difficulties of the Czech Republic. So more than 2/3 of the population perceived the economic situation as bad, surely before the 2013 election, which was twice the level as it was at June 2008. And this was accompanied by a decline in political trust, which was fed by government crises, corruption scandals, and a seemingly systemic symbiosis between political parties on the one hand and well-connected private businesses on the other. And so what this shows is that although, yes, anti-corruption rhetoric is kind of an easy way for a party to go, it doesn't get much grip on the public imagination unless the issue of corruption itself is politically salient, which it clearly was in the Czech Republic. So when it comes to ideology and the kind of style of populism, Reisner and Hebenstreit argue that ANO is an example of a technocratic populist party, given, unlike many other populist parties, they don't rail against technocratic elites, either at home or within the EU. And this aligns with the populists' classification of ANO as a populist party, but not far left or far right, or Eurosceptic. As Havlik notes, the populist technocratic anti-party discourse of ANO and Babis fitted perfectly in the atmosphere of declining political trust, critical evaluation of political parties, and negative attitudes towards politicians and politics in general, and was reflected in the electoral base of ANO. Neither ideology nor policy attitudes nor specific social class predicted support for ANO, unlike the established parties. Instead, positive assessments of competency to deal with the most important policy issues increased the chance of voting for ANO in 2013. So their appeal wasn't based on positional issues like left and right, but rather their ability to get things done. And as mentioned, ANO and Valence populists more broadly aim to transcend left-right divides. For ANO, this was part of an anti-political, anti-party narrative. And although the party initially leaned to the right, and Babis himself admitted he'd voted for the centre-right Civic Democratic Party in the past, it soon made an explicit decision to develop a clear, or to sidestep rather, a clear ideological profile, and sought to kind of bring together all groups of voters with a non-ideological appeal. Both the objective and the subjective lack of a clear host ideology could be identified. And furthermore, Havlik shows how ANO made fewer positional statements than average and more valiant statements than other parties within the Czech Republic. Now, when it comes to ANO's populism, it did not define the people strictly in terms of a nation, an ethnic group or religion, rejecting some of the more nativist or racist approaches of right-wing parties in Central and Eastern Europe that we looked at last week. However, unsurprisingly, it didn't adopt the class approach usually employed by the radical left. Instead, ANO's people-centrism used traditional notions of Czech golden hands, which refers to an alleged high level of craftsmanship and the popularity of a do-it-yourself approach in the Czech Republic. And so we're going into this kind of identity-based myths, right, to create a construct of the people that is not, again, not necessarily exclusive, right, because it doesn't say who is and who, it's not saying immigrants aren't Czech or whatever, but it's not necessarily inclusive because it is still based on Czech people, right, which you typically can't change. So the populist heartland that kind of Anno constructed, an almost mythical notion of Czech people, was not defined in ethnic, racial, religious or class terms, but rather on a kind of idealised set of qualities, so hard work, manual skills, brightness, wit and diligence. Anno's anti-elite appeal focused on a general denigration of the established political parties, regardless of their ideology, and Anno employed the terms traditional political parties and later, partly as a reaction to the criticism of Anno's party's own undemocratic nature, so-called democratic parties. So it is attacking a political elite that is based on political involvement rather than, and because those parties are corrupt, allegedly, rather than the more kind of shadowy elements of kind of that we see in populist radical right parties, or the economic elements that we see in populist radical left. There's not an attack on the EU as a whole. There's not an attack on big business. There's not an attack on the ECB, on the IMF, or any global capitalism, anything like that, right? The problems stem from how political parties manage the country because they are corrupt. So we see, with the reference to themes and motives of efficiency, tying the concept into Valence populism and common sense. Babis heightened his own origin story as a hard-working, self-made businessman who had started his business from scratch, presumably unlike lazy politicians, and this pitch to the voters was reflected in the slogan, "I will run the state like a business," which Anno took into the election campaign and was later changed to "run the state like a family business." Effectiveness was tied to common sense, both of which established politicians lacked. One promise made was that Anno would run the state simply, effectively, using common sense. Right, so this ties both to the idea of the general will, but also to the aforementioned technocratic populist approach. However, as we've noted with other populist parties, this form of technocratic populism can still pose a threat to liberal democracy. Hanley and Verstove note, in his published writing, Babis offers a vision of illiberal democracy with a technocratic rationale that involves centralising state powers and stripping away checks and balances in the name of efficiency and moderation, to be achieved by running the country like a firm. Now, this might be in theory, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence, especially when you compare to places like Poland and Hungary, of the Czech Republic under Babis evidencing democratic backsliding. And in a prime example of populist campaigning, before the regional election in 2016, Anno created a website, We Want a Better Czechia, where people were asked to tell Babis what they dream about and what they were afraid of, which constructed the image of the party leader as someone whose decisions are based on the will of the people. Organisationally, eventually, the Anno initiative became the basis for the Anno party, which was registered in 2012. Anno took part in the 2012 Senate elections, but none of the candidates supported by Anno made it into the second round of voting. Right, a two-round runoff electoral system is used for the Senate. As Havlik notes, this disaster was a blessing in disguise and led to the party investing in political marketing and professionalisation to become a fully fledged business firm party, unlike the five-star movement, say. Despite the fact that Anno was registered as a political movement, not a political party, because, as stated by Babis's marketing advisors, people hate new political parties, the real operation of the party has been extremely leader-dependent and autocratic, not growing out of the grassroots activities that are generally considered to be the essence of a movement-type organisation, as we saw with the five-star movement, or when I covered that in the five-star movement slide. Indeed, membership of the party is not encouraged, and it's at a much lower level than rivals, as you can see on the slide there, where Anno has 3,100 members in 2020 compared to 31,500 for the Communists, 21,700 for the Christian Democrats, and so on and so forth. That's typical of a business firm party where membership is discouraged. Furthermore, you can see that in the Brexit Party as well, actually. It's a good point to mention. Furthermore, Babis's company, Agrofert, bought two of the country's most important daily newspapers, including the digital versions, 2 weekly newspapers, a radio station just before or shortly after the 2013 election, which allowed for a very intensive media-based election campaign. Right, it does help if you're a new party, if you can buy local media. It finished with 18.7% of the vote and 47 out of 200 seats, and became the most successful genuinely new political party in the Czech Republic since the first free election after the fall of communism. Okay, but essentially, organisationally, a business firm party. The Slovakian Ordinary People and Independent Personalities Party is described as a catch-all, populist, anti-corruption and pro-European political party. Similar to ANO and the Five Star Movement, it presents itself as a movement and claims to be not a party but a platform upon which independent personalities, I guess, and experts have a space to run for office, given the Slovakian general election law does not allow for non-partisans to run independently. It won the 2020 general election with 25% of the vote, and its chairman since its founding in 2011 is former businessman Igor Matovic, who is the current Prime Minister. Local contextual issues add to the populist potential in Slovakia. So the 2018 murder of a journalist, Jan Kuciak, undermined the popular belief that Slovakia is run by a triangulated cadre of powerful oligarchs, political bosses and organised crime syndicates, which included the then Prime Minister Robert Fico, who was leading the ruling SMER-SD party, or Direction Social Democracy Party, that had governed Slovakia from 2012 to 2020. In 2018, Fico resigned as Prime Minister, and in the 2019 presidential election, the lawyer and environmental activist Zuzana Kapitova, a political novice who entered the race on an anti-corruption platform, beat the Fico-endorsed candidate in a race which, according to Rossi, was lauded in Western media circles as a defeat of populism and nationalism. The next year, the populist Olano won a plurality of the votes, so I'm not quite sure how that works out. So in terms of ideology and populism, early on in Olano's history, in 2012, SPAC notes any clear ideological definition is by nature problematic, as the party seeks to serve as a platform for non-partisans of various ideological backgrounds. And, unlike ANO and Five Star, Olano does not reject the left-right categorisation as vehemently. It remains, for a time being, an ideologically amorphous identity. Remember, that was in 2012. In 2020, Rossi claimed that Olano is centre-right and operating on philosophies of Christian democracy, which, he argues, certainly helped in a country where the electorate is largely conservative, Catholic and parochial. Olano is conservative, but not hard-right. This does align with Popper's classification of the party as conservative, rather than no family, like the Five Star Movement or ANO. But, like SPAC said in 2012, there were several indicators that Olano has especially taken centre-right voters away from established parties. Now, as to be expected with Valence populists, the populist element in Olano has been important from the beginning. In accordance with its name, the party assumed the role of representative and defender of ordinary people, and took a strongly critical attitude towards the political establishment. Furthermore, SPAC notes, many parties in Slovakia use populism as a transitory tool, right, which typically ends after their first election, and use it as a strategy to get elected. But Olano has been much more consistent in its use of populism. However, there are some interesting elements to Olano's populism which make it stand out from other populist parties. So in terms of the people, like ANO, Olano see the people as good but poor citizens who are victims of a decayed establishment, and includes ethnically marginalised groups such as the Roma people in their conception of the people. Now, obviously, this is massively unlike the populist radical right. Look, for example, in Hungary, in Poland, who see the Roma as an external threat to the people. Olano's focus instead is on the integration of the Roma into the education system, the labour market, housing and security. So given the level of hostility to the Roma in that region of Europe, this makes Olano much more inclusionary than other Valence populist parties like the Five Star Movement. If both the Five Star Movement and ANO were perhaps ambiguous on the inclusion metric, inclusion-exclusion polls, then perhaps Olano is closer towards the inclusion side. Now, the people and Slovak national identity are also under threat from others. Whilst for ANO this was due to migration, Olano sees the biggest external enemy in Russia, right? Due to Russia's recent history of imperial expansion and destabilisation of other countries, especially Ukraine. Again, this difference is partly contextual. Slovakia is geographically closer to Russia than the Czech Republic, for instance. As previously mentioned, in the Slovak case, the establishment is comprised of corrupt elites, outdated, corrupt, non-transparent and ineffective bureaucracy, biased, slow and undersized justice and lobbyist groups which are not regulated, as well as too involved in public policy when their interests differ from those of citizens. At the core of these complaints, though, is corruption. Corruption which these parties argue should have been ended after the fall of communism in 1989, but on the contrary is still spreading, as is oligarchy and clientelism. For both ANO and Olano, the European Union is not the enemy. As part of the establishment, it's not seen as part of the establishment working against the people, as it is perhaps for, say, UKIP, or was for UKIP. ANO claims that despite the supranational institutions, the Czech Republic has a greater influence on events on the continent, whilst Olano committed itself to contributing to citizens' confidence in the European project. So it's actually quite pro-EU in that sense. However, unlike ANO, which kind of lumped together all political parties in with the elite, Olano's discourse about corrupt elites is targeted more specifically at the main government, the main governing left-wing party, Smer SD. Olano specifically hold them accountable and responsible for crumbling roads, hospitals and schools due to the poor investment or lack of investment from EU funds. The leader of Olano, Matovic, claimed he became a politician in order to oust the thieves, which eventually transformed into a campaign against the leader of the left-wing party, Fico, with the main slogan, Fico protects the thieves. So we have where ANO includes all parties as part of the elite, Olano only includes really Smer SD, right, the main left-wing party that was in government at the time. Partly, again, this might be strategic, and it knows it might need other parties in terms of a coalition. And an interesting analysis by Engler et al. Find that Olano's rhetoric and the use of language shows that their populist appeal is much more consistent across the three main elements of people-centrism, anti-elite sentiment and general will. So they are kind of the whole populist package, but unlike other populist parties, including the Valence populists covered earlier, Olano seems to emphasise or represent a truly corrective approach to liberal democracy. They see strengthening of democracy as their main priority in government due to a wave of extremist and populist groups, ironically, that undermines foundations of European integration and democracy. And interestingly, they argue that they want populism to end. So to that end, they emphasise a strong civic society, which is seen as the main pillar for democracy. Unlike, for instance, the Five Star Movement, which is critical of civic movements, and Olano support more citizen involvement, not only in policy formulation, but in decision-making, like populists do. But it is, in some respects, an anti-populist populist party. And in terms of structure, unsurprisingly, for a party which focuses on promoting independence, it has only minimal organisational structures. And as SPAC noted in 2012, it shows no ambition to become a classic party. The entity continues to present itself almost as a civic association, making it more attractive for independent candidates to run on its ballot. The only fixed point of the party is the party leader, Igor Matovic, whose dominant position is comparable to that of other populist party leaders. According to Wikipedia, the party had just 45 members in 2019, and that is, it has fewer members than it has elected representatives. So they're not trying to be a broad-based movement. Okay, so as I said before, analysis by Engler of Olano's rhetoric and use of language finds that their populist appeal is more consistent across the three elements of populism than other parties, and this seems to be, we can extrapolate this to other parties within that framework, right? So what I've done here is I've taken these different classifications by Popper for radical right parties, radical left parties, so the two main populist party families, and Valence populist parties. And actually what we can see is that on general will, on people-centrism and on anti-elitism, the Valence populists are pretty damn populist, right? The radical right, it might look like the radical right is slightly more focused on the general will, But again, we've got to remember there's only about 6 parties counted as valence populists. So we've got a very small sample size or range of valence populist parties here. And also valence populist parties are being dragged down by the Belgian GERB, which, as we said at the start of the lecture, is a bit of an outlier, and whose inclusion within the valence populism party family doesn't really fit with other parties studied. They have a large membership, around 94,000, and they do place themselves explicitly on the centre-right or the right wing. So maybe that outlier is dragging the valence populists down. But either way, general will, people-centrism and anti-elitism, we can see valence populism ticks all boxes. On the left-right overall position, but we can see that actually valence populists are placed in the middle compared to radical right and radical left. That doesn't mean they're less populist. In fact, they're more populist on average than the populist radical left. And when it comes to nativism, and we can use this perhaps as a barometer of the inclusionary-exclusionary pole, we can see that valence populist parties are slap bang in the middle. Their average is 5 on a scale of 0 to 5. So it does seem to me that these are a distinct group of parties, right? It's not a residual category. They can be useful, but as we say, these things are always up for debate, and there's no real evidence that these valence populist parties encourage democratic backsliding compared to what we might see amongst populist radical right parties in Europe, specifically Poland and Hungary, or populist radical left parties in Latin America, like we saw under Chavez and Evo Morales, for instance. So hopefully this lecture has been interesting in that we've looked at some cases you might not have heard of before, and introduced a new topic. You might notice the reading list is quite sparse this week. That's because there's not much written on this concept. You might find next year it's an interesting topic for dissertation. It's a fresh area, is what I'm trying to say, but an interesting one nonetheless.